Thank you so much for joining us on It's Time today. We are your hosts. I'm Lindsley Donnelly, your citizen scientist and your longevity expert for midlife women.
And I'm Dr. Jen Wagner, physician and holistic performance expert. Welcome to It's Time, powered by Prosper. Just a quick reminder, the information discussed in this podcast is for informational and educational purposes only. We are not offering medical advice, nor are we entering into any type of physician or clinician relationship with listeners. Always consult your healthcare provider before beginning any new fitness, nutrition, or lifestyle changes to ensure they're right for you. Your health and safety is our priority, and let's keep it that way. Hey, everybody, welcome back to It's Time. We are so excited to have you back with us today. And Lindsley had a great idea, as we're always brainstorming new things to talk about. And really, what we want to share with you guys is as we get into the next change of season and start thinking about things, is really let's dive into our brains and how our brains work. And we talk about a lot of this stuff, but we kind of skip the 101 and the basics. And not even just I shouldn't even say basic, the foundation to say, why are all the things we're suggesting, why do they actually work? So we're going to rewind a little bit and kind of go back to the foundational lever of neuroscience and why we have this amazing ability to continue to change and grow our brains.
I love that setup because I feel like that was the most freeing thing when we started to look at this whole, powering up our high half, was this idea that you can rewire your brain however you like. We dive into the science about how 65% is environmental and lifestyle choices. And yes, there is some genetic component, but even that can be malleable with focus and lifestyle levers. And so I think that is super freeing about if you want to put your mind to work on anything, you can. But it's helpful to understand the mechanics of it. So some of the brain science that you are so expert in, especially at making it easy for the layperson like me to understand, is great. So I'll dive into that. But maybe if we set up our conversation today and just talk a little bit about neuroplasticity. It's a term we use in a ton of our different episodes. We talk about mindset and where that came from and kind of where we are on understanding that curve. And then maybe we dive into some of the actual neurochemistry, since those are the things that we are tracking what we're doing with our lifestyle levers. Those are the things that are being impacted by those actions.
Absolutely. I think that sounds great.
Awesome. Great. So on the neuroplasticity, kind of the 101 on that, I felt like this was relatively new awareness and mainstream, was that you can rewire your brain. Your brain can reorganize itself by forming new connections and by remapping connections. And that was a belief held, I think, in the mainstream until even like 15 or 20 years ago, that the brain structure was fixed. But what I didn't realize until we were kind of doing some research for this episode is that this idea of neuroplasticity has been in development and in research for 100 years. And it's one of those reminders when we're trying to get in the prototyping habit ourselves, is like, there are ideas right now that people are researching that are going to be norm at 100 years from now. And it's fun to be able to get exposed to those early and start to digest what they might mean in our day to day.
And I think, a lot of this early neuroplasticity work came from when we would see infants with these catastrophic brain injuries. So especially these premature babies where there's sometimes some bleeding in the brain and they can have a lot of trauma and sometimes have significant amounts of their brains removed. And yet different parts of the brain would rewire and develop to take on those functions of the parts that were removed. And so we thought that that was a phenomenon that only occurred in the truly developing brain, where these things are going on all the time. When that early part of life, those synapses are growing so quickly and that process is kind of on overdrive. And then as we age, even into like this, our young school age years, that process slows down. And so we eventually thought it just went away. And so it's such great news for all of us that it doesn't. And so I always think a great reference is it's like any other muscle. You always call it the mindset muscle, but it's like any other muscle or thing that you're training or activity. At first, it's hard. It's going to take a lot of attention. It takes repetition. It takes time. But if we stick with it, we can do it. And so I think to just kind of plant that seed around neuroplasticity is, it doesn't mean that you try the New York Times crossword puzzle for the first time and then all of a sudden you're an expert. Like, you have to develop those skills and that way of thinking and coming back to it and working through navigating challenges and working through problems and keep going. Like when you're tired or you don't want to do it, just like going to the gym or these other things. So
yeah. I love that reminder because I think that that mantra of you have to do the action even when you don't feel like doing it. That's like when
Hmm.
you have to do the action the most. It's
Hmm.
like you got to do that. So the
Right.
mindset work. So
Right.
one thing that was helpful for me when we were thinking about neuroplasticity too is realizing that there are kind of like three categories because we talk about it really broadly, like oh, we're going to rewire or reconnect the synapses. But if we think about okay, there's this structural plasticity, so that's growing new things or neurons and synapses. There's functional plasticity, which is like your brain function usually happens here, but then it's going to hop over here, which I think that is amazingly cool.
Hmm.
It can move into different parts of the brain. And then the synaptic plasticity, which is strengthening or weakening the synapses. So that helped me kind of envision the mechanics.
Right. So let's make sure everybody knows what a synapse is. So
Yes.
when neurons connect, like they kind of make this cool chain. And so the synapse is like the little space between the end of one and the start of another. So this neuron kind of has a tail and it kind of meets the head of this neuron. And in that space, there's these, it's very, very, very microscopically small. There's little vesicles that sit on the end of one that kind of flood that space and activate the next neuron. And so the more that pathway is developed, the tighter those synapses are. So they work better. So if you think about it, it's like a well-worn road. At first, it's kind of bumpy and jarry. And once you get it kind of go over it several times, it gets smoother and smoother and faster and faster. And so that's what a synapse is. It's just that connection.
That is so cool. Thank you for making it easy for us to
Yeah.
understand.
All right. Keep going. Sorry. I just want to make sure we're all on
Yes.
the same page talking about the
Thank
same
you.
thing.
Yes. And then, so I know we're going to get into the specifics of what we can do as individuals, but there were kind of in the discovery of the application of neuroplasticity and the history of it, there were like these five categories where it was occurring or the application was really clear. So stroke and recovery. So people who were rehabilitating from strokes, that's one of the great like breadth of examples. So if you ever need some examples to convince yourself about what you can do, that's pretty compelling to see all of that there. And then even as adults, when we're learning new skills, like we're learning how to play an instrument or we're learning how to play pickleball, or we're learning how to dance or a new language, that is building new pathways and supporting that neuroplasticity. A lot of the work with trauma and PTSD and trying to rewire brains and processing that trauma. Chronic pain, I didn't realize was able to be impacted with by neuroplasticity, which is pretty
Mm-hmm.
cool. And the last one, I guess, really is the one we're talking about all the time foundationally is just aging and cognitive resilience is powered up by doing this rewiring just for the sake of teaching your brain it can rewire.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because I think you're right. It is taking what we've learned in all of those very specific and almost healing mechanisms and kind of like what all of this that we talk about is we're taking knowledge about how do we fix the sick or heal the sick or recover from this and translate that into a preventative state. And so this is kind of that same idea. Like we can take all of this research that has come, whether it's looking at infants or elderly that have had strokes, looking at people that may have had surgical parts of their brains removed and what recovers and what doesn't, which is actually
Right.
fascinating in and of itself. And, people that have lost a sense, you always bring up the learning to read Braille and how that
Yes.
changes not only structures, changes actually anatomical size of different parts of the brain. And so I think that now it's like, it's so great that we know we can do this. Now we can do it in a preventative way to say,
Yes.
we know that cognition goes down. So these are the things that we can do. We've learned it in kind of the sick way to keep us healthy, to keep our brains healthy.
Yeah.
So I think that's pretty cool. And I think, again, too, the better we are at doing it in our everyday life, if unfortunately something happens to us or a loved one, we already know what to start doing to recover.
Yes, yes. Just underscoring your point, it won't feel easy. Like you read these things and we're going to talk about actions you can do and it will still feel awkward when you're trying to do it.
Yeah, for sure.
Should we talk a little bit about the neurochemistry before we get into the kind of action items?
Yep, let's do that. Let's do that. I'm referencing a list just to make sure we don't mess anything up. So
I love that.
I definitely think that's good. So our brain functions on chemical signal for a lot of it. And so those different kinds of chemicals are names that we hear a lot. These hormones and these neurotransmitters. So we're talking about dopamine and serotonin and oxytocin and endorphins and norepinephrine. So these are all different chemical messengers that influence our moods, our behaviors, how we learn, the way our synapses work, all of these things. And so I think this is really important. We were talking about this before we got started. We know through midlife that these change in our brains in response to our hormonal patterns, our systemic hormonal patterns changing. So those changes in estrogen and progesterone and even testosterone really do change our brain's neurochemistry, which is why there are some pharmaceutical agents or medications that are really helpful through this time of life for midlife women, because regardless of estrogen leaving, this brain chemistry is still changing. And so there's things that we can do that if that is the most symptomatic part of this midlife experience, there are some very targeted interventions. So that's why we wanted to go back and kind of review the basics.
Yes. And, I love the way that you kind of set this up for us too, Jen, is like, we're going to go through each of the chemistry components, chemicals one at a time. But if you think about them in terms of overarching functional categories, so there's like 4 functional categories. There's mood and happiness, which we think that's every single chemical, but it turns out it's really a subset of them or in concert. Focus and motivation, which I think this is one I learned a lot about when we were navigating ADHD and trying to think through how to support that best, which is great to know that there are ways to do it. Stress and calm. So I always think that kind of factors into mood, but it's really its own subset of chemical reactions. And then I love this idea that there are chemicals that actually support learning and growth.
Yeah, for sure.
So it's like, whoa, okay. So, once we know which ones those are, then we can talk about what are the actions that we can do and access as individuals to amplify some of the effects through that chemical chain.
I love it. So let's start. You want to start with mood and happiness?
Mood and happiness, yes.
Okay. So break that down for us, because I think you describe these in such an approachable, digestible way.
Well, jump in because you've got the science behind it. I've got the layperson's terms. Because I think these are 4 that most people have heard a lot about: dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, and then endorphins. And so we hear a lot about dopamine, and there's been a ton of research with dopamine in the context of foods and substances and now screens and all of that component. But it's basically motivation, reward, pleasure, goal pursuit, habit formation. That is all triggered by the dopamine chemistry.
I think that habit formation is big, right? You do something, you feel reward, you get this reward and reward and reward. So yeah, so dopamine's really big on that connection to reward.
And then serotonin, which I always think of that as kind of the calming, mellow, feeling all right. How do you get a little more serotonin when you've got yourself all wound up about your to-do list or things like that? So that's more the mood regulation, happiness, and just calm.
This is not a total accurate comparison, but it's kind of like the yin and yang of estrogen and progesterone a little bit, right? They both contribute overall positive, but they're kind of excellent at a little bit different sides of it. Right. So dopamine's very activating, energizing, and serotonin, while you need it to be activated and have energized, it kind of does that in a calmer way.
It's like a soothing agent.
Yeah. And a little more stabilizing across the board. Yep.
Oxytocin. And, this one I know I shared this story. We've done it in a couple of different contexts about oxytocin. When I first learned about the difference between boys' and girls' brains when we were raising kids, this example comes up, which I'll share in a minute, but it is trusting, bonding, empathy, social connection, oxytocin. And you do the great explanation about why our teenage girls especially separate from us, because they need that social connection and they've got a jacked oxytocin as they're working through those teenage years. And then the example that this parenting expert was teaching was to especially tell your daughters that the moment where oxytocin is highest in a male is the moment right after orgasm. And so to not misinterpret what's happened right after sex as a long-term relationship trajectory.
Yeah. Right.
Which I thought was like, okay, all right. Well, I'll try to log that from my teenage parenting moments and remind people of the brain.
Yeah. And, oxytocin is a really complicated hormone. It's involved in recently pregnant women and lactation and things like that. And so that's, even part of the breastfeeding connection to your infant, and that breastfeeding, eye contact, gazing, all of that is all oxytocin too. And so I think, you can see it in these different realms, but that's even the idea behind like the 10-second hug, right?
Yeah.
Is to start producing some of those connections. And I think we're realizing how important that is, not only and it doesn't have to just be in a romantic partner, that you can have oxytocin release by being with a friend, by, just that connection to someone else is so important.
Yes, I love that. That is something that you can behaviorally stimulate as well. And then the last one, kind of in the overall mood and happiness group, is the endorphins. Which, the first time I started hearing about endorphins, I always heard about it in the context of a runner's high. That was you're generating endorphins, but it really is that the natural pain release, the pleasure, the euphoria, the runner's high, is that endorphin set of chemicals.
Yep. So again, all so important for connection, mood stabilization, being happy. All right, let's go on to I feel like we're going to get a little more complicated as we continue, as these neurotransmitters might be less familiar. So we're going to keep this pretty high level. Let's go on to focus and motivation, and you'll see some overlap here.
Right, because dopamine, of course, plays into that, right? The habit formation component. So dopamine's in the focus and motivation. And then I really have a hard time pronouncing these words, Dr. Chin.
Okay, norepinephrine.
Norepinephrine, yes.
Yep, and acetylcholine.
Acetylcholine, thank you. And
Well,
thank you for that. Those are, I'm just like, I know there's two in there that help us with focus and motivation, but I cannot say the words.
So, norepinephrine does a lot of things in different parts of the body. And so it depends on where it is. It does one thing in our cardiovascular system. It can do some things in our GI system. But in our brains, it is focus and attention. And so, we can have norepi release from breathing, from exercise, from all of these different things. So pretty much when you have done something and feel more alert after, there's a good chance norepinephrine has been involved, if that makes sense. So whether you've cold plunged and you get out, and you don't want to be doing the math equation while you're in the cold plunge, but about 10 minutes after you get out of the cold plunge, you're pretty focused and dialed, kind of the same idea that, and we've talked with Dr. Wendy Suzuki about this, and other neuroscientists about exercise. Yes. And how, for 2 to 3 hours after exercise, we're pretty focused and can be pretty dialed in. And so using that as a tool to increase your norepinephrine levels to then get that central nervous system response of that kind of focus and attention piece. And then acetylcholine's a hard one. Acetylcholine, it's in our muscles, like it has a lot to do with muscular contraction and movement and things like that. But in our brains, more learning and memory, it's really important. So again, that's why we sometimes say, move before you have to focus. Move before you have to learn, or move while you're learning. And so you're actually kind of full body increasing some of these neurotransmitters that are playing a different role in your brain than what they are in your quadriceps or your biceps, but it's all still being released systemically. And so you're getting that brain boost. And so we're trying to connect some of these dots for you when you're like, I thought norepinephrine just made my blood pressure go up. Well, it does, but it does these other things too.
Yeah. I love knowing that, because we get into the mechanics of, all right, if you want to impact your focus and motivation, and then we'll talk about the behaviors that you can do, but it's nice knowing that you're doing it through that chemical pathway.
Yeah.
So should we go to stress and calm?
Yeah, let's go to stress and calm.
It's just okay. Because, cortisol, we hear so much about cortisol. And I think at one point we heard so much about cortisol that it was like, I just associated it with it being a bad thing. And then now that kind of has rebalanced, and it's like, actually, you need cortisol. It is helpful.
And so cortisol, which gets such a bad rap, we actually really need it.
Yeah.
We'd be dead without it. So that's important, but we got to have things to balance it. And so we have GABA, kind of the primary, we would call it, it's not a negative thing, but it's considered a downer neurotransmitter, not an upper. And then there's a whole section of molecules that connect to the cannabinoid receptors, which is the same thing that THC does if you're using cannabis, but we produce some of these chemicals naturally, and they're hard to pronounce. And even I stumble over these words, but anandamide is one that is getting more attention, can be found in some foods that you'll go into in a few minutes. But it's that same idea that it's So, GABA in the medical terms, we talk about being an inhibitory neurotransmitter, that some of these other things are more calming or inhibitory. Instead of regulating up, they help regulate us down and can provide, again, that kind of smooth area of focus, the calm state that we need to learn and also need to recover in. So I don't know if you want to add anything there.
Well, it was new news to me. I didn't really know anything about it, but I think it's getting a lot of awareness now because it's associated with when you're in that flow state. That's kind of a associative effect of that chemical. And then the other kind of interesting thing is, you and I do a little bit of yoga practicing is that the Sanskrit word for joy is the root of the word. So it's associated with not hyper joy, but more like that calm, blissed out sense.
Yeah.
It's kind of cool.
Yeah.
And then the last category,
learning, growth, all things that are important to us.
And we've talked about two of the hormones already, dopamine and acetylcholine. But the other one that I learned about probably in the last couple of years that I think is such a cool one is the BDNF.
Yeah.
That's just like, and there's a lot of wellness and longevity experts who focus a lot on how to generate BDNF, but it is the underlying neuroplasticity accelerant.
Absolutely. And again, another chemical in our bodies that's generated by exercise. So kind of just reconfirming that movement to cognitive support and how important that bridge is.
Love that.
Okay.
So at this point, we could just go back real quickly through each one of the chemicals and call out some of the things that we can do in our own day-to-day lives. And maybe if there's ever a pharmaceutical recommendation that you'd flag as well. But if people want to try to impact these sets of neurochemicals, what do they do?
Yeah. And I think, a really kind of pretty quick and dirty way to remember these things is things are not changing in the direction we would like them to through midlife. So if it's a positive hormone, if it's our dopamine and serotonin, it's probably going down. And if it's a hormone or a chemical we'd rather keep in check, like our cortisol, it's probably going up. And so how do we get back in balance, right? And so that's really, our bodies work really hard to stay in balance across every organ system. Our brains are no different. And so that's why it can be so disturbing when they start to get out of balance. And then, when we're really out of balance is when we get into more psychiatric problems. But even these little shifts can be very uncomfortable, concerning, scary. Yeah. And so what can we do to try to keep these in balance? We'll kind of try to hit each one a little bit and give some lifestyle levers that we know really help to balance this. And then if that's not working or not enough, which sometimes it's not, what are the other options?
Awesome. I love that setup. Thank you. So dopamine, because we hear about that one probably the most. I think, you've already talked about cold exposure, which, it does impact a number of the chemicals, but dopamine for sure is increased with cold exposure. And then high protein foods are a way to get in there and just add in something on the nourishment side. And then behaviorally, and this gets into the neuroplasticity component, showing your brain that you can set small goals and achieve them. I think one of the expressions I love from the Design Your Life work is set the bar low and clear it.
Yes.
Doing that generates dopamine.
Absolutely. So we have to remember it is the reward. And so this is, we tell a lot of people, you're working on hydrating, give yourself a goal. And if you do it, maybe you get a little water bottle or a special, it doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be expensive, but it can doesn't even have to be materialistic. But when we forget to celebrate, our brain does not get that dopamine reward that we did something great.
Yeah.
This is also where an accountability partner can be really great. Tell someone what you're going to go do and let them cheer you on. That is very helpful as well.
Yes. And our friend David Stewart over at Super Age does this. He talks about it in a couple of podcasts, is that he'll actually say to himself, "Good job, David," and give himself a pat. It can be that little, right? Just you telling yourself you did a good job is starting to generate the dopamine and do the rewiring.
Yep.
Awesome.
Perfect.
Okay. So serotonin, sunlight exposure, Getting outside, especially doing kind of an aerobic activity while you're outside, helps generate the serotonin. And then we talk about this in so many different contexts, but the gratitude exercises, the gratitude journals, the gratitude writing, any of that is a support system for serotonin.
Yep. And serotonin, we need some carbohydrate to generate it. So, not being afraid of a little carbohydrate. And serotonin is probably one that we have more pharmacological agents designed for. These are the SSRIs, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So these are classified as a category of antidepressant, but can be used in different dosages for different durations for a lot of midlife women who are starting to feel out of balance from a mood standpoint. And yes, we know the cause of that is estrogen's withdrawal from the brain, but that doesn't mean your serotonin is not unbalanced. And so
Yes, yes.
it's not I know there has been frustration in people who say, well, I'm not depressed. And it's almost using those medications in a different way to restore balance, to help with maybe some anxiety and some other things, even though the withdrawal of estrogen is causing it, it's causing your serotonin to be unbalanced. And so that is actually still real. And so there are some other pharmacological agents that, if doing the lifestyle things are not enough, have been very well proven and have great safety records that can be really helpful. So don't suffer is kind of what we're saying.
Love that.
Yeah.
Oxytocin, and I think you already brought up the great one, which is it's physical. It's generated by physical touch, by eye contact, by acts of kindness, by hugging and holding that hug for 8 seconds.
Yeah.
Or our dear friend who was sharing the other example of that, when you kiss your partner, to actually hold the kiss for 6 seconds, it is the chemical is generated with a little bit of time. So,
and I think we're in a phase of life where I mean, sometimes it can be like my kids don't really want physical attention that much anymore. And so trying to actively participate in those things. And it's important for kids to know too, that, like there's a value to this. There's a value to this type of connection, and it actually keeps people connected. So
yes. And if you don't have a partner, or you've got kids who don't want to hug, petting an animal, that's another way you can generate this chemical, is interacting with animals and physical touch.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, endorphins, because I think we talked a little bit about the runner's high. So, the exercise. I thought, a lever that triggers it, which I thought was fun to hear, is laughter. So, I mean, I will find myself sometimes on Sirius radio. I'm like, I'm just going to listen to pure comedy, like the Clean Comedy Channel. Just get like a 5-minute burst of laughter.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think those are probably the best ways. It's hard to synthetically. I mean, you can, I guess, in some ways that we probably shouldn't synthetically increase your endorphin level, but
we're not going to recommend those.
We're not going to go there. But yeah, no, I agree with everything you're saying, and I think that a great time to utilize those skills, because endorphins are a natural pain reliever too. That if you're going into something that might be painful, to be able to, obviously you can't really go exercise sometimes in those situations, but to do something that might make you laugh or distract you in those ways to increase some of those chemicals in your body.
Now, I did read that dark chocolate you can use to help with a lot of these chemicals.
I love that is sometimes the go-to in a lot of these areas. It just justifies every time I reach for that snack, other than just the enjoyment of I have from saying, good job, Jen, have some dark chocolate.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. This next one, you have to help me pronounce it again.
Norepinephrine.
So, some very similar impact from cold showers with dopamine, because you already have raised that one here as well. And then deep breathing can actually be a behavior tool here to try to generate the little bit of this chemical. Mm-hmm. Goal setting. One of the other levers has been HIIT workouts. And, I think that's because of the sprint component, really jacks, and then you have the recovery. So when you're doing your sprint interval training that we talk about, is such a beneficial thing in midlife and beyond, know that you're helping that specific chemistry set as well.
Yeah. And I think that, an interesting thing about norepinephrine is it has very different effects outside the central nervous system versus inside the central nervous system. And so there are, again, kind of a line of pharmaceuticals, and again, kind of labeled as antidepressants or anti-anxiety medications that target norepinephrine levels in the brain. And so again, if, this is an important thing to just have on your radar and be able to have a discussion with your healthcare provider about, that if this combination of lifestyle levers and you're still kind of suffering with some of these symptoms, there is additional support in other ways that targets a couple of these neurotransmitters in particular.
Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, GABA. So GABA, I talked about this, the over-the-counter supplements to support here, but then also meditation, box breathing is kind of a lever to this, yoga. And then I think on some of the food fronts, and maybe in the show notes, we kind of can break down behaviors and food fronts for each one of these chemicals. But on the food front, it's things that are magnesium rich. So almonds, spinach, and then we talk about magnesium in a number of different contexts, but knowing that that is another support there.
Yes. And yep. And again, there's some other things that can play into GABA. And GABA is I think in the scientific community, a pretty exciting receptor right now, and people are really trying to come up with lots of different things that target the GABA receptors because it plays such a broad role. We used to just think it was pretty narrow in this inhibitory role, but now we realize it's probably more complicated than that and wider spread its influence on kind of our overall mood and health.
Cool. So maybe we're going to learn more.
Yep. More coming.
Yay. Choline. I'm trying to think of new or different ones. I mean, this one, on the food front, it's eggs, right? Things that have choline-rich foods, salmon.
Yep.
And so that's a nourishment lever. And then things that trigger a lot of the reinforcement of the learning side of this impact is just the studying and the deep focus.
Yep.
Behaviors.
Yeah. Again, and this is another one where exercise can play a role. And again, kind of another has one function outside the central nervous system, another function inside the central nervous system, but exercise can increase our levels of acetylcholine. And so just another great tie-in.
Awesome. Cortisol, I feel like, has gotten a ton of play. And so we know morning light helps, we know sleep helps and sleep hygiene, we know meditation, we know breathing. And then of course, if you're sensitive to caffeine, if you don't metabolize it well, it can be a stimulant for cortisol. And then, all the stuff that makes us stress, like staring at our phones.
Exactly. And most of these neurotransmitters have some sort of intrinsic biologic cycle to them and how they're released at time of day, under what stimuli, et cetera. I think the important thing, especially for women, and we're learning more and more about this, is our cortisol levels are high first thing in the morning. Everybody's are. And we need that. We need that to get our bodies going and to get up. But then we tend to turn around and do a lot of things that just continue to raise them to a point where maybe it's becoming a disservice. Maybe they're getting to the point where they're triggering our bodies to break down instead of build, do those types of things. So, and I know we've talked about this in a lot of different places, but making sure in the morning, what can control that cortisol level is nourishment. And so this is a great place to have some protein. It can be your protein drink. It can be powder in your coffee, but to signal your hypothalamus that I'm not starving after that kind of 8-hour fasting window of time in bed or sleeping, and maybe even longer if you stopped eating a few hours before bed, and kind of trigger to your hypothalamus that food is back on board. I don't need to be in this starvation mode. I can lower my cortisol levels. And especially if you're going to go exercise, that's really important to be able to get the best benefit out of your exercise.
Yeah, that's a great reminder. Okay, and then the last two, the BDNF. So the kind of what can you do to help build your brain? And that's the intense exercise generates that. The overnight fasting might be also a generative effect on creating that chemical. Omega-3s through food or through supplementation, and curcumin, which is a spice. I didn't realize that was actually associated with BDNF growth, but it's kind of fun to know when we throw in the nourishment levers that you can get there with some spices as well.
Absolutely.
And then just doing the different things and, trying to build a new pathway in and of itself generates this chemical too.
Yep. Perfect.
And then our last one, anandamide, is same kind of levers, the exercise, meditation. I like that dark chocolate can help here too.
And those are pretty closely tied to endorphins as well. Like there's a lot of similarity there that, you tend to get sometimes, like if you're doing something that is very vigorous and you get hurt, you don't feel pain right away. And that's kind of that receptor interaction as well. And so that's kind of what can trigger those molecules.
Yeah. It's like all of this stuff, the great simplification for us always tends to be, so exercise, movement is medicine. Like movement is medicine across every single thing you want in your life. So
Right.
to do it, and you can now cite specific chemicals that you're impacting as you do it. Breathing and meditation, they're levers across life. Get good night's sleep. And then there's always the nutritional things you can add in and amplify when you're trying to impact a specific chemical.
Right. And I think, and then not to forget the connection piece as well, that being around another human or an animal that brings you joy and comfort, and taking that 10-second hug or that 6-second kiss or the 5 minutes of like just petting and enjoying the dog really is critical to our brain health. And, we see that even it's part of the reason that we have emotional support animals. It's part of the reason we bring, this is science-backed data that we've studied in hospitals by bringing, there's a hospital in the UK that brings a horse, has a therapy horse that comes into the hospital and visits these patients in bed, and it creates that oxytocin and that bonding and that even a little bit of dopamine that they're so excited, like all of those things that are so beneficial. So, we go back to basics a lot here, but it really is, we got to take care of our brains. And I think almost every person, and I know you and I have just been through the ringer on this with elderly parents and cognitive decline. And I think it's probably something that is more critical to me than even my physical decline, like just preserving my ability to think and to function and to learn. And so going back to where we started, that our brains can do this.
Yes.
It's a lot of work, but we are entering a phase where maybe we can do things that are really enjoyable. And, even I started laughing, like I went to Italy last year and I was like, I'm going to learn Italian. Did I really learn Italian? No. But did I sit down with my Italian app on my phone for 10 minutes a night and like try to do something new that was hard? I did. And so it doesn't mean you have to commit to something that I'm going to be fluent. If you can, great. But even saying, I'm traveling to X, and so I'm going to learn about that culture, or I'm going to cook foods that identify that and learn a new skill that way, or I'm going to practice the language a little bit and be able to ask where the bathroom is and how to get a taxi or something, So I think doing little challenges like that can be so helpful in this phase of life. So I feel like sometimes we feel like we have to tackle something huge. We can just do little things.
I love that. 15 minutes a day, just trying something hard on your brain.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I know we've got a couple of these that we're going to come up and do in upcoming episodes around the science of manifesting, like why wiring your brain a certain way can help you hit certain outcomes, and some of the neuroscience behind how you do the neuroplasticity. But I appreciated just getting the nuts and bolts of what is going on when we say neuroplasticity, and what are the chemicals that are in there doing things that are helping facilitate that rebuilding of your brain.
Absolutely. So come back into our series. We're going to keep marching it out, and we will talk to you all soon. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for spending your time with us here today. If you liked what you heard and you got some tips on how to live better right now and for the long haul, please help us reach more midlife women. Please share and rate and like this show, and we can't wait to continue the dialogue with you on our next episode. Until then, thank you. It's time.